Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Peter Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa, since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. It's been a really quiet period in the Talking Transformation podcast universe. No podcasts since June 2024, and apologies to all the listeners for the break in transmission, just allowing some downtime and some interesting work assignments that have been ongoing. Nevertheless, I'm looking forward to concluding the year with some quality insights and conversations with colleagues and interest groups across South Africa. This first episode of a mini-series we are hoping to complete in the weeks and months to come, and it's a very special podcast series, an introductory episode that I recorded with colleagues who over a period of time have worked for or currently working for the City of Johannesburg up in Gauteng. I'm joined in this episode by Johan, a mentor, a great friend, and a colleague of mine back in the City of Johannesburg days, as well as the more recent time working in the Ranyaka space here in Stellenbosch, Western Cape. Also joining us is Nkateko Shiplana, who I worked alongside after Johan had left. You'll hear from Nkateko about his experiences working in the Metropolitan Planning space. Then we will hear from Thandeka Mlaza-Lloyd and Weakley, who both have served in that space as the Metropolitan Planning Assistant Director, and last but certainly not least, in the hot seat as it stands today, a recent appointment in that space is Minenhle Maphumulo. Between us, we share a common bond, each of us having been appointed as the head of Metropolitan Planning in the City of Joburg, and between us, with a few months here and there where others have held the reins and acted, we pretty much cover 24 years of the operation of the Johannesburg Metropolitan Municipality. It's a pool of talent and shared responsibility that really gives us a great opportunity to reflect on the City of Joburg. One that, irrespective of where we are currently, whether it's here in the Western Cape or Joburg, in the Gauteng region, it's certainly made as a space and a workplace an indelible mark on each of us. Whilst there are overlaps between us, no one was fully familiar with all of the team, so this was a really interesting conversation, and what better way to kick it off than with introductions and a sense from each of us of the immediate and sequential challenges that were facing us. The hope and desire is to unpack a number of these key issues that have faced Joburg over the years, and those that continue to present both complex challenges and opportunities to the city. As always, I'm indebted to the time and candid reflections shared by my colleagues, and hope you'll enjoy listening to the episode as much as I did recording and editing it. Looking forward to the future episodes. In the meantime, enjoy the episode. It's just coming up to 5:20 on the 1st of October, 2024. Hard to imagine we are almost at the end of 2024, a year that has absolutely flown by. And a couple of weeks ago, I found myself up in Johannesburg at a conference with the Development Action Group talking about land release, land mechanisms to make land available for affordable housing, and came across two colleagues, Weakley. Dylan, you and I have known each other for a number of years. In fact, I think since you were back in the day a student. And also you were there with your colleague Minenhle from the Metropolitan Planning Unit. And that was the immediate interesting straight line that we said, hold on a moment. We've got three of us in the room who've worn the T-shirt of being Assistant Director, Metropolitan Planning for Johannesburg since 2000. Been in contact, worked closely with Johan over the last couple of years. Johan, Olivier, who would have been the first of the Assistant Directors for Metro Planning when the City of Johannesburg was constituted in 2000. I'm in contact with Nkateko, and then I was told, but there's also Thandeka. If you get a hold of these six people, you could probably have a really interesting conversation and a really interesting podcast around the history of Josie as we've seen it through a metropolitan planning lens. So often the podcasts that I recorded have been with guests on everything but metropolitan planning. And I thought this is too good an opportunity to be true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you landed in the space of the City of Johannesburg within the Metropolitan Planning team, and what was the major thing that was keeping you busy on that first few months of you taking on the role. And I'm going to start right at the beginning. Johan, Olivier, the first of the team, first of us, Post-2000. Tell us a bit about what you found, Johan, when you walked into that space.
Yes, Pete, I must also confess, I didn't know there's a profession called town planning. Let me just start there. Finished my school, I went to certain things, and then in the third year after school, I realized, well, I enjoy people, I enjoy economy, I enjoy space and architecture. And then I found planning, studied at Poch, got a bursary from Joburg. Tian Ehlers was still there, very young. I don't know if he's still there, but he's the guy that gave our bursaries to us. So since my second year, I was actually working in Joburg with a lot of senior people that's probably not there anymore at the moment. So that's where it started, my interest in planning. I was really fortunate to get the bursary from Joburg, started my career. Then Ahmad moved to Midrand, asked if I want to be a sort of the chief town planner for Midrand. Guys, we were very young and stupid and naive. We moved, because of that period of our history, we moved from junior planners to principal planner within 2.5 years. Because everybody left us. We lost 40 planners that just went Ireland, New Zealand, wherever they could find. So we had to learn very quickly, Pete, and it was quite an interesting period. So I think it was, for me, just an amazing introduction to town planning and to Joburg. Loved Joburg, but I didn't want to stay in Joburg because we always thought, don't stay where you plan. You might get problems with that. But that was the introduction. Left for Midrand, was very fortunate. The CFO was 3 doors away. So if you needed any funding or anything, you just walked 3 doors and you could speak to the CFO. So it was really amazing. Moving back to Joburg, as I say, we got there, myself and Ahmad, and there was a fax machine and cafe sitting there on the 10th floor empty. And the mayor said, look, 11 RSDFs within 3 months. And in the meantime, also do the MSDS for us while you're busy doing that. And there was so much inter-office dynamics. We actually physically attacked each other at some stage to get some documents from the previous guys that did the MSDF. So it was quite an amazing for a young planner. And then, of course, the whole capital thing came where the mayor said we need to look more strategic at the capital planning. And I had a week to come up with some sort of a framework for capital investment for the city of Joburg. But what helped is the youngness and the naivety. Of course, you think, oh, well, let me go and read and speak to people. And I think that's where the whole capital planning started, which I think was quite a big thing for the town planning department to play that role in terms of capital planning. So it was just an amazing introduction to Joburg. I still think it's an amazing city. Stay close to Cape Town. I still think Joburg, if it's run well and everything, is just an amazing, probably our only world-class and world-size city that we have. Left the city, worked with Akanya, the sort of consultancy, for another 10 years. And then we started Ranyaka in 2013. We're now 10 years old, really trying to connect with communities in the planning field. How do we get them to get involved in decision making? All the stuff at Shiplana and all these things are asking of us. So the last 10 years was an amazing journey with communities and how they see their role and their partnership with cities and with the things that cities are doing, the IDP. I still get confusion when I sometimes ask, do you know what's the IDP? And then communities will they have never heard about it yet. So, but I think that's the journey, and I'm really excited to learn because the city is still our major growth engines. And if we can get communities and local businesses and private sector to really connect with that, I think there's an amazing opportunity. Private sector don't know necessarily how difficult it is to run these places. I'm always amazed when people think it's easy, but it is an amazing, difficult thing to manage. And I don't think everybody knows that. So I want to applaud everybody that you're still there and that you're contributing to just an amazing story. So that's sort of my quick history, Peter, and where we're coming from.
Johan, it's really special, and as before we came on, I described you as the godfather of this because I say from 2000, that was the period where those metros were established in a new era, new democratic era of planning, a massive game changer. And even though there's been 6 years of transition from the local administration space, so much was changing from the land development objectives, the LDOs as they were, then the forerunners, the IDPs. And then, as you say, you're into a situation of a whole new administration, new ward councillor arrangements, ward committees back in those days, corporate South Africa saying, what does this mean for my investment planning, my thinking, and where I'm going to move physically, whether it's from a central business district to a newer area like a Midrand, a Sandton, whatever that might have been. And then, of course, your efforts would lead to the establishment of the very first spatial development framework post-2000, published, if I'm not mistaken, December of 2001. As I recall, if next up on the rank in terms of chronology, I come and work with you, Johan, and Kathy and the team there, and Thoril in a really exciting period, probably from about 2002 through to about 2004. And I worked under you and trying to understand everything about how a spatial framework at that metropolitan scale was going to work. So a lot of the early days of using GIS to try and inform some of our thinking, our analysis, thinking about growth management as a thing. What does growth management mean for a metropolitan city, which is essentially urban edge, urban development
boundaries, the line is it yes, there was a lot of discussions.
The whole thing of the provincial edge and how that would start to play against the municipal edge, which one has precedent. And I mean, these things sound now almost like small things, but at the time they were big decisions. 2 lines on a map. How do you then unpack that? What was the role? And the DFA and the court rulings would ultimately show very clearly that planning is a municipal competency, and that was a sort of a watershed moment. But I stepped out for a period of about 10 months working for Johannesburg social housing company, Joshco, which is, as I understand, still going. And that was an interesting experience. I'd always been very interested in housing. And so to be involved in that was quite an interesting change in scenery. But when you left, Johan, it was a real pleasure and massive undertaking to come back in to fill those big shoes as the second of the assistant directors of the Metropolitan Planning team. And we built a team there with, again, always a small and compact team, but always really trying to be at the cutting edge of the thinking, trying to influence, picking up those conversations. And I think by that stage, the directorate had grown not just for the Metropolitan Planning Division and the districts, which were rather regions that were going to deal with the different regions and how that was unpacked and unbundling a metropolitan perspective into different spatial areas, was also the idea of an infrastructure and capital planning unit, which had really started to establish itself. And we'll probably get into a bit more of that detail. Things like in my period, the run up to 2010, and all of that came with the infrastructure planning, the BRT, the Rea Vaya that was put into place, the Corridors of Freedom initiative that would come on the back of that. And Nkateko, you'll remember, and no doubt when we pick up the baton with yourself, you're taking on from my role was the Sandton and the Rosebank and a Midrand, those Gautrain stations, how could they look? And when I see it now, and I think, Johan, you and I were there a couple of years ago together in Rosebank, in one of those newer precincts corporately. And it was that moment of like, wow, planning can have an impact if you do it right in terms of what an urban landscape can look like. And we can bemoan certain elements of that, whether it's around the inclusivity of that, the opportunities missed around land value capture, around the Gautrain multi-billion rand infrastructure. But from an urban landscape point of view and functionality with pedestrians first, I look at Rosebank and I look at Sandton. It is astonishing. So that idea of scale, putting the plan in place, back the plan, put the infrastructure in, it can have impact. That's certainly where I think that was my lesson. By the time I left 2013, I think it was, from the city space, we had a competent and coherent, well-established spatial development framework for the metropolitan scale, really well articulated throughout the regional spatial development frameworks. The concept of transit-orientated development, even if we weren't calling it as strongly as that is in places like Cape Town. When I arrived here, Cape Town, it was there. It was talking about density. It was talking about inclusivity, things like an inclusionary housing policy being drafted, I think 2007. We'd looked at growth management issues like the urban edge and how we could start to enhance that with inclusionary clauses. We looked at the nodes, boundaries that would, I think, ultimately become part of a nodal review and a very exciting next part of the journey for Josie. But let me leave it there. As I say, we can talk for hours just about that period between 2004 and 2012. So much happened, such an exciting period, so many of the foundations laid. And the final thing before I hand on to Nkateko, that importance of get the infrastructure and the asset planning as part of the routine, and the rest will follow. And I think that's one of the things that would be interesting to pick up where we're at now. But Nkateko, I'm handing the baton on to your good self. As I say, you and I worked together in the team. You were in the regions at that stage, if I recall correctly, but quickly would take on the mantle of metro planning. Tell us a bit about, I hope it wasn't too bad a mess that I left it in. How does it look when you got there and arrived?
Yeah, I mean, like I think I joined the city of Joburg around 2006 in land use planning. I mean, at the time, I was fresh from varsity vets. And from a planning perspective, I mean, all I knew was Leonie Sandercock and all of those great theories around how planning ought to be, you know? And there was, like, I mean, at the time, there was not a lot of training around, you know, what's actually going on. And there was some effort being made to sort of at least introduce, you know, some of the students at vets to, you know, Joburg, what Joburg is doing, especially around, you know, spatial planning, what's happening with the new metros, etc. And when I joined land use management, I really sort of did not expect that very administrative type of planning. I immediately applied to development planning and facilitation, it was called at the time. And I remember Herman, you know, like saying, you need to develop your skill set first before you think about money. And I'm like, hey, I'm broke. I need money, you know. Be that as it may, about a year and a half into land use management, I immediately did a lateral move straight into spatial planning. I was involved in the regional planning at the time. There was the metro planning that Pete was busy with that sort of guided what we needed to do. We needed to review the regional special development frameworks on a yearly basis. We had to go out to communities to talk to them and try to get that input and come up with a plan. Pete, I don't know if you recall, you know, we started that process of going to these high schools. We're trying to bring in the voice of the youth into spatial planning and maybe, you know, try to understand, are we doing the right things? Are we thinking the right way? Are we sort of really meeting the needs of the people of Joburg, basically, you know? I mean, that was a really fun time, you know. That was when I was in the RSDS. When you left, Pete, I think I took on the mantle around 2014. There was a lot of acting after you left between me, Margot, and I think Krishni at some point. And then I took on the role of metro planning. Pete is a workaholic, and the stuff that he was doing there was like way ahead of his time. And I think it really laid the foundation for what we did next. The whole discussion that was happening at the time with National Treasury around reviews of planning, budgeting, and implementation, you know, aligning spatial plans to infrastructure plans to the budget process with the CFO. Reggie Borgo was the CFO at the time, and he was very, very involved in trying to make sure that we align those items. But I think the most interesting part when I was there was when the mayor, which was Parks, went to the UN conference and met the executive director of UN Habitat. And between him, Yondela, and Herman, they figured, hey, how about we try and test out this evidence-based planning thingy? And we're going to let Nkateko run with it, you know? So there I was running around with Herman trying to find funding to bring in some French company to come in and do GIS work, trying to do evidence-based planning. We brought in the UN Habitat itself to assist us in developing an SDF, because we were reviewing the SDF at the time, developing an SDF that is aligned to their urban design principles or sustainable neighborhood principles, and trying to figure out how, we can really apply them in Joburg. Like up to now, I think the COJ SDF is the only one on the UN Habitat website out of all the SDFs globally. That was sort of a really fun experience. And I think my team was me, Dylan, and Lorraine. And so when I was frustrated, I was like, Dylan. We had like a lot of good conversations around how to improve planning, make sure that it's evidence-based, make sure that it's aligned to, the good work that was done in terms of growth management, strategic spatial prioritization in the corridors of freedom and the mining belt, and sort of aligning all of that to sort of some form of budgeting framework. But I'll let Dylan sort of take on from here.
We've already seen this afternoon. I don't know how many years it is since the last of the two we worked, but we've already had the Dylan, I need you on the IT side at the very least. So that was really special. And I think the other point that you're raising there, Nkateko, and certainly was my experience, not just in COJ, but also within the City of Cape Town space. It's often about the individuals that are working with you and around you that provide that environment to be creative, to be adventurous, and to take risks, not reckless risks, but to take risks that are based on more than just a gut feel, but often that are evidence-based. So I think it's about the people around you as well is such an important part of what you're describing there. Whether it's a handful, literally, of two people, or it's never been a big team in my experience, and I assume that's probably stayed that way. But thank you for that, Nkateko. Appreciate your reflections, and let's I say, hand the baton on to Mr. Weakley. Dylan, tell us a bit about how was it. How did the office look by the time Mr. Shiplana had left? I hope it was better than what he took over from me, I hope.
Thanks very much, Pete, and thanks, Nkateko. Thanks, Johan. Thanks, Minenhle, Thandeka. Good to see you all. When I joined the city, I actually forgot what year it was, early 2015. I joined from BITS, where I was working as a researcher under Paul Harrison, where I'd also done my postgraduate studies. So I'm also a Vitsi. I knew Nkateko as a sort of older, cooler student that I wanted to be like at BITS. I knew Pete. You sort of guest lectured with Sarah Charlton on a course module we had. That was the first place I met you, which was great. And you, the first time I ever got city data was from you for that course. And we mapped town planning applications compared to the urban development boundary, which was great. A really good introduction to the whole idea. So joining the city, I think I had rose-tinted glasses about what was possible. Also, having worked for Phil Harrison, who was also the previous executive director of the department before, when it had the name Nkateko was talking about, that also included urban management at the end. That was the thing Phil always complained about the most. He said he wishes it was just the urban planning, not the urban management side. But yeah, joining the city, I think it was an amazing experience. The first thing I did on the first day I arrived, Nkateko and Herman were presenting the draft SDF that they had put together, the one he was talking about, done with the Urban Morphology Institute, with UN Habitat. And it was really a groundbreaking document, I thought. So the first thing I did was go with them to see them presented at different committees. I think there were Section 79 committees or something similar. And really that spiel that I learned from Nkateko and Herman in those presentations is still the spiel I tell about development in Johannesburg. And I'm sure it's the spiel that Johan and Pete said before then, and it's obviously evolved. And we all know the story. Compaction, transit-oriented development, the whole story. And it really is something I think that Joburg, and I've learned, speaking to other cities, traveling around, that Joburg really has led the way in terms of planning. So the next job I was given was to edit the SDF, which was also an amazing thing to do. The second time I rejoined the city, the first job I got from Thandeka and Zaid Ibrahim was to edit the IDP. So I got these quite cool introductions to and getting thrown in the deep end of the work that the department was involved in. So I agree with you, Pete. It's very important the people you're working with. When I joined, I was working with Nkateko and Lorraine Zamande, who he's already mentioned, who now works at the City of Cape Town. And really two inspirational colleagues, and I learned a huge amount from them. But also our leadership at the time, Herman Pienaar, Yondela Silimela, and as Nkateko's mentioned, Mayor Parks Tower. That was a very interesting and very powerful thing, the sort of common thinking that those three leaders had, Herman, Yondela, and Parks Tau. And that really did drive a lot of the strength of the department at the time, and allowed for things like the SDF that Nkateko started, that Lorraine and I and Thandeka sort of finished off and got it approved. And a lot of other things, the corridors of freedom and things that have already been mentioned by Pete, were really given momentum by this sort of strong leadership group. So I think that's a great thing. Then sort of after that, this heady start of getting the SDF approved, learning all this stuff, sadly, one day Nkateko came into the office and said, I've resigned, I'm going elsewhere. I think I just went white, in shock. But now all of a sudden, Lorraine and myself are going to have to deal with this thing. But, we did. And again, and I got the opportunity to then drive the process from there. Also to note, I'm the only person here that actually was never official assistant director. I only ever acted, but I did act for almost 5 years in total. So I think I can't.
You definitely qualify by de facto, or whatever the word in fancy Latin you wish to use. Dylan, you're one of us, and you wear the T-shirt with pride. And that, again, it shows you that extraordinary ability to sometimes, as you say, that moment when the leader says, I'm moving on. It's that sort of you go cold. But the ability to pick it up and to use what you've learned to adapt and to change and navigate within the space that you're now occupying. Yeah. And with that comes a great degree of responsibility. But the privilege of that, I think, is such a special thing. And I say, whether it's an acting position or whether it's within the actual, with the title, it's a very special thing. And again, thank you for explaining your journey.
If I can just say one more thing, sorry, just before I go on to Thandeka. So there were then a few more of those moments, because the big change that then happened really was totally unexpected, out of the blue. None of us were expecting it. Parks Tau didn't get a second term. Yes. And that was the beginning of this political change that we've been seeing in the city. And I suppose maybe that's where I'll end, because that's sort of really when Thandeka joined us, and her and I worked on various things like nodal review and inclusionary housing. But I think that's a big part of the story. And following that, Herman Pienaar resigned. He had said sort of before, if the change happens, he really didn't think it would. You probably would move on. He did. After a while, the end of Yondela's 5-year contract came and it wasn't renewed. So it sort of started this transition period that I think we're still not out of. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think it's another really important part of this story, Dylan. It's no doubt going to permeate throughout all the conversations that we're going to have and the different chapters of this conversation. For someone like Johan, myself, or Nkateko, who had obviously worked in that space from, whether it was 2000, in a straight line ANC environment, straight line from the national, provincial into the metropolitan space, that was like an earthquake. And even though I was in the Western Cape by then, I felt it here in Cape Town. That massive shift, and knowing that those are, I'm going to call them tectonic plates, politically were shifting, and that would have repercussions. And I think we've seen that. And it's going to be fascinating to hear from Thandeka and Minenhle, their journey. And let's hand it over. Thandeka, tell us about, how did the office look that you took on from Dylan after 5 years of squatting in that space? How did it look?
Hi, everyone. Very grateful to be part of this conversation, to just be around such wealth of knowledge. And I'm happy to meet Nkateko. I think having moved into the office you used, I probably have your entire life, because you left so many personal documents. So I'm really glad to finally put the face to all the information that I have. So who am I? So I think it's been introduced. I'm Thandeka. I come from the Eastern Cape. I'm not a Witsi. I'm not a Gautenger. Small town. So you can understand the sort of dynamic of stepping into Joburg, and particularly the planning space for Joburg. Just a bit of context. I've just worked in cities all my life. I've worked in the Buffalo City. Then I worked in Nelson Mandela Base Metro, and then the City of Joburg, obviously. It's all planning, but it's different types of planning, because each city comes with a different set of complexities. And in trying to sort of weave what planning means and how to drive planning in these various spaces, you get to appreciate the various challenges that you then go through. Joining the city, for me, it was the very first time being part of the city transformation team. I don't think, colleagues, you've noticed there's no other metro that actually has a particular office that is just set on dealing with transformation within the urban space. So for me, that was quite interesting. That was something I was really excited to explore. I didn't necessarily join Joburg knowing that I'll be part of the metro team. It was more about the office itself and the agenda of the office that was most important for me. What did I find there? I mean, I found Dylan. I found Dylan. As much as Dylan, in his closing remarks, indicated that he hasn't actually been officially been part of the position, but I think for me, Dylan was quite an asset for me coming into that space because he was very strong technically and understood Joburg, understand the dynamics of Joburg, and also how to drive certain things. So for me, it was quite a nice tag team to have worked with Dylan. And essentially for me, city transformation, it was just nice being part of a pioneering team. I think it was mentioned before that if you come into the Joburg space, you push boundaries, I think, which is one of those cities that's able to push boundaries, that's able to chart territory for other cities, rightfully and wrongly so. So I think for me, it was more that being in a space where there were less boundaries that held me back. I suppose the management at the time, also the flexibility and the space they allow you to then exercise pushing those boundaries. So that was quite useful for me. And I think obviously looking at Joburg, Joburg has it's a unique city. There's very unique complexities about it, the migration, the population, the diversity, the potential that Joburg holds, the significance that Joburg holds from a country point of view and a continent point of view, because we become the gateway then. Having all of that and understanding that, okay, now how do you plan around all of this is quite interesting for me. In terms of understanding, internalizing and driving the SDF, I think Dylan was quite strong in that aspect, that this thing was busy with the nodal review, coming up with this, coming up with that. So I think we were quite a good tag team. I think we're a tag team, Dylan. What then became a challenging or complexity that I then had to deal with was, how do you ensure that the SDF remains sustainable? And how do you ensure that the city stays committed to driving the SDF? How does it continue to become a priority over a sustained period of time? I think Dylan has alluded to the fact that just when I come in, that's when you would have the change in our political climate. Obviously, the change in the political climate comes with change in priorities. So how do you ensure that the SDF remains the beacon or the driving policy around spatial landscape? And I think that's where, I think for me, it was quite an interesting space to be in. How do you also insulate the SDF from external forces? We have a lot of provincial, national directives coming into the space, despite of us having Shiplana, and Shiplana saying then we have jurisdiction of our space and we then can drive the SDFs how we feel. On paper, essentially, it's like that. But in reality, you then have external forces that then come in. So how do you, again, ensure that the SDF, in whatever form that you're driving, remains the policy that then sees the test of time? And also understanding that the outcomes of the SDF are not outcomes you realize in a year or two. How do you also ensure that having a policy of that nature, you still garner and keep the support for it and the traction for it from the people that matter for a sustained period of time, even if they don't see tangible real life results today? So I think for me, that was one of the most interesting spaces I've sort of danced in and driving the SDF. Pete, you mentioned this in the beginning where you said you're still surprised when you go around and people don't understand what an IDP is. Try getting someone to understand what the special development framework is. An IDP, they've even heard, they can theorize on an IDP, but an SDF, how do you ensure that the SDF remains a priority for Utabo, who's in Orange Farm, Utabo was in Soweto? How do you even ensure, because that's the only way that we'll see our policies outlive our political landscape, is if our communities internalize them and our communities prioritize them from the ground up. Again, how do you then dance within that space where you try and make sure that the SDF is a priority from that perspective going up? So those were some of the maybe challenges or highlights that I think within my tenure, which was very short, that was it from my side. Thanks.
No, thank you, Thandeka. It might have been a short tenure in that space, but I mean, you're still there at the city, if I'm not mistaken, working within the spatial transformation and projects. And it'll be interesting to hear how the new position has been shaped by your experience as we continue these conversations. But last and certainly not least, and in fact, probably the most important contributor, because she's living it right now, is the current Assistant Director of Metropolitan Planning, Minenhle. It's absolutely fantastic to have you here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing. You've heard from every one of your predecessors, everyone who tried to get it right, struggled, fell over, gave up, moved on. You're in it. Tell us about your experience, what you're enjoying, what is keeping you busy and on your toes in 2024, and maybe what did you find when you first arrived?
Firstly, thank you very much for the welcome. And yes, we are getting the name Minenhle. Definitely kudos. Firstly, it's amazing to be here, to connect, meet everyone. I think you have done a stellar way in paving the path and the direction in terms of how to take Johannesburg towards the 2040 vision. So I think it's definitely exciting to be here. Just to maybe backtrack as to where I come from and how I come to the city. So I'm a Durbanite of origin, but I'm also a Vitsi with the rest of the colleagues. And I came from a engineering consultant company in KZN, so that's where I started off. Not for very long. And then I joined the city in 2017 as an officer and have made my way to now AD Metro Planning. During that time, I have worked in close proximity to Dylan and Thandeka and Lorraine, actually, from Region A aspects with Lorraine, and then moved to Region B work. So predominantly, most of my time has been within the regions, and then took over from acting when Dylan left last year, beginning of the year, and then officially from July to date. My time within the city from 2017 has given me great exposure to the Metro Planning team, as it is one. You know, I've been with City Transformation, which is the unit, for some time. So I think I've had good reach and a clear understanding and the positioning as to what the SDF is and how best it fits into the other tools that have been developed. I came at an interesting time, just as the nodal review and the inclusionary housing policy, which my colleagues were working on quite strongly, were at its final participatory process through the regions, but also towards its approval. So there was a very interesting moment in seeing that and being a part of those sessions, and in how evidence-based planning was also just really being so critical in the methodology of the nodal review. I think that was quite exciting to see. And also just the shift to now the different scale. I think the first and foremost, from regions to citywide is quite a big scale to tap into, and the various aspects that you must also consider. As Thandeka puts it, not only is it just a citywide, the reach for Johannesburg and its importance and how much of an anchor it is, not only for the country and how much of an engine it is quite important to ensure that you maintain even collaborations, external partnerships. You look out as to what else is happening in and around other cities and what else is there to learn and better and advance. So the handover from Dylan came also at an interesting time, besides politically, also just some changes in terms of administratively, and in that the SDF had begun its review process in a very particular environment as well, which began in 2021 under COVID environments, which was also a spanner in the works in how you participate and how you engage communities and you ensure that inclusion and incorporation of various inputs with minimal contact at a citywide scale. So I think even coming into that review process was quite interesting. I think Dylan had just gone out for official public comments and had initially synthesized those thoughts. And so what I came into was a draft iteration of the review of the SDF with comments, of which then means backtrack a bit, understand all the edits and all the changes that have been made from the 2016 vision to what we have now as the latest iteration of the latest version, 2024, which still upholds and really is committed to the polycentric city form, maintaining the growth and the dividend growth as we have attempted and as the team here has driven Johannesburg towards. I think what became key challenges around that time, besides ensuring full participatory process and ensuring that all views are considered and heard, infrastructure was put to a real quest. And there's a real pressure in the commitment to what the SDF upholds in contrast to how the city looks and feels currently. What is in reality, and as Thandeka highlights, is it creates a lot of questions around what we have already committed to in the SDF and in what we uphold. So there's a lot of key question marks that have been interesting debates even around the urban development boundary. I think that's definitely a key pressure points that the SDF is constantly challenged by, those debates and the commitment to compaction, and not just for Johannesburg, I suppose even as a planning tool and ideology, compaction, how far do we go, and densifications, the chicken and egg situation, infrastructure and densities, how long does it take, when do we see the improvement? And the components, I suppose, of urban management that we would have wanted to drop out of the spatial planning becomes a critical aspect now, and how the inner city is still, for instance, such a critical anchor to the SDF and the city and the country in essence. But the way it's shaping and looking raises a lot of eye-opening questions, and maybe questions even within the planning fraternity as to how best we can build up evidence in supporting and build up tools in measuring urban performance. So data tracking and analysis becomes quite an important aspect for city transformation. Now, in building more data and more numbers in saying, okay, let's reflect. How are we proceeding? How do we do better with infrastructure and understanding the pressures, the decays, and the need for what Dylan would be working on now, the capital expenditure framework, becomes an important aspect as well in considering and pushing us towards the Johannesburg that we'd like to see. So I think there's a bit more definitely to share, but those are some of the critical aspects and key questions that we are grappling with. But yeah, we have now the latest version of the SDF, which is going through council approval and crossing fingers that we don't have hurdles along the way. I think I'll wrap it there for now. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Minenhle. I really appreciate it. And all the best. I think we've all been there waiting on the council approval. We all know what that feels like. We all know what it means to get it on the agenda and then hold your breath and hope that you get that approved. So in all seriousness, best of luck. I also think you've given us a fantastic naming convention for one of our future conversations around the chicken and the egg. What comes first? Because that conversation, I think we've all had that moment where you are tested in the public arena around, but if you're going to densify, what about the schools? What about the infrastructure? Those are completely legitimate questions that are being raised. And I think sometimes what we tried, and through the various iterations of capital expenditure frameworks and prioritization, we've always tried to answer that in a fair-handed way, but it's often not enough in terms of winning the public argument. So that'll be, I think, a really useful conversation to pick up on. And particularly, Dylan, the work that you're doing on the capital expenditure framework, the CEF. And I was reminded when Thandeka was saying, it's one thing to try and get the IDP understood, try the SDF. And I'm thinking, try the CEF, the capital expenditure framework, and to explain these sort of Russian dolls. They all are looking the same shape and they're all trying to fit in a particular way. with a fancy design or a fancy wording at times that I know is often an accusation against us as well around how can we simplify our terminology. But these are the realities. It is a technical space. What's really impressed me as we've gone around the room, the virtual room, has been how each of you have talked without notes, without prep, just the ability to talk about these issues with such passion and recall around where you were and how this has shaped you, whichever space you're in now, whether it's Johan in the NGO space, Nkateko out in the private sector, the Dylan having gone out and come back into the city. It's foundational. I think it's in our DNA of all of us on this call. Anybody who we worked with in that space for a period of time, you can't help but be impacted by the work that we've done there in Joe's. It is an intoxicating place in so many different ways, but it really leaves an indelible mark on us in our careers. I'm hoping what we can do is come back into this space on a routine basis and pick up some, because obviously what we've done now in a very, it's taken us already almost over an hour to introduce each other. And it feels like we haven't even started the conversation. And if I think about just that sort of trajectory that we've covered, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Johan represents that genesis, that inception of the post-2000. There was then a sort of transition between Johan's period and my period where we started to quote unquote gear up for growth. That enormous, the place like Freden Park and those huge townhouse developments in the spurt of the residential property boom in the 2000s that ultimately tested things like infrastructure, growth boundaries. Then this idea of infrastructure and prioritization between 2004, 2010. 2010, it's about the infrastructure and the policies to shape a BRT, a multi-billion rand trunk route on a mass transit system, and obviously the infrastructure around train and the stadiums, etc. How massive a shift that was. And then, of course, the dramatic change that I think Thandeka and Dylan alluded to, that transition politically around an agenda switch from an ANC aligned to various iterations since then. And so it'll be interesting to see which of those components have been retained, which of them have been challenged, and maybe rightly so, given their different political thinking. But these are the things I'd like us to come back into. And I just want to get a sense from the group, are we all happy that this is something we can come back to, revisit? And hopefully those of you who are listening to this as a podcast that we'll put out under the Talking Transformation banner will be inspired. We will, in due course, look at a bit of an agenda around the conversations that we'd like to have. And perhaps each of us can take the lead on a particular theme and take us through a conversation and almost a facilitated conversation. And perhaps at the end of it, we end up with a webinar of sorts where we invite anybody from within the planning student fraternity or other of our colleagues working across the metros, across the secondary cities, to have a bit of a conversation about this without an agenda, without a political agenda or anything, just as town planners, talking about issues which are important to us. So I really, I want to thank everybody for their time this afternoon. It set the scene. It hasn't even begun to scratch the surface. And that to me is what's really exciting about it. So to all of my colleagues, A, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. B, thank you for sharing your journey. And what an amazing opportunity this is. So to each of you, thank you so much. We'll be back. We will see you again before too long. But in the meantime, please look after yourself and keep safe.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you, everyone. Great to see
Thanks,
you.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you all. Thanks, Pete. Cheers.
Lovely stuff.
Bye-bye, Pete. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this content of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please feel free to give us feedback via our Twitter platform. That's @TalkingTransfo and the number 1, or alternatively via our email address talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Thanks and recognition also to Tribal Need for allowing us to use their track Flags as our introductory and closeout music on this podcast.